I have the pleasure to invite Dr. Jeanne Mortimer. Dr. Mortimer has been working with sea turtles since 1973 in many parts of the world, more than 20 countries on 6 continents, but is especially interested in the Western Indian Ocean, and of course, particularly in Seychelles, where she has permanently settled. She loves Hawksbill turtles. So Jeanne will be talking to us about satellite tracking for the migrations of post-nesting Hawksbill turtles in the Seychelles. Over to you, Jeanne.
Thank you, Marie-May, and thank you everyone for who's attending my talk. Okay, yeah, I'm going to talk about satellite tracking the migrations of post-nesting Hawksbill turtles in Seychelles, and one of the sites that I track them from is Cousin, so that it follows quite nicely on Claire's excellent talk. I want to give a shout out to my co-authors on this work. In addition to myself, Rainer van Brandes, George Balasset, Marine, U.S. National Marine Fisheries Service, Ryan Daly, who you already know, Lara Sousa, and Peter Hitchens from Cousin Island. Okay, just to put things in context with Hawksbill turtles. The Hawksbill is listed by IUCN as a critically endangered species. And Seychelles has one of the 5 largest nesting populations nationally. So, you know, it's one of the 5 countries with the biggest nesting populations. And this is kind of a rough estimate of the numbers of females that nest each year these days, in Seychelles. And you can see that the inner islands host the highest number of nesting Hawksbills, followed by the Amirantes, and then followed by Platte and Coitivi. And then in the southern islands, you have small populations at Farquhar, Cosmoledo, and at Aldabra. But when you think about it, these are, for a total of about 1,635 females a year, that's not that many turtles. And it also shows how important the inner island populations are. Now, why are the southern islands so sparse? It may have something to do with the fact that there's 8,000 to 10,000 green turtles nesting each year at those islands. And if you're a little Hawksbill, you have to make sure that you're partitioning yourself away from the green turtles, because Hawksbills dig clutches that are about 50 centimeters deep, and green turtles are about 80 centimeters deep. And then elsewhere in the Seychelles, there's only about 500 females in total at all these other sites. Going back to the late 1990s, when the first part of this study was conducted, in the inner islands, the situation was that we knew that during October to January was the nesting season, and the females were at the nesting beach. But then between February and September, you didn't find females at the beach. So they went somewhere else, obviously. But we had been tagging hundreds of nesting turtles, and they were only seen again at the beach. They were not recovered at other sites more distant. So this raised the question, where do nesting females go after the nesting season? Now, the guess is that they probably would stay away from people and away from land because they were not being captured at other places. So they weren't feeding near people. So we wanted to answer this question, and we went to Cousin to do it because that is the most important nesting site in the inner islands. And we satellite tracked 5 post-nesting female Hawksbills from Cousin Island. We used ST-14 Telonics transmitters. The project was funded at that time by the GEF project that was underway. That was Project J1, the Turtle and Tortoise Conservation Project, and partially funded by Cousin Island. And I'm very grateful to Peter Hitchens and Mr. Keeley, who made that possible. And our tracking at that time was assisted by George Balasset, U.S. Marine Fisheries Service, and also, of course, by Cousin Island. This was our field team at the time. Some of you may recognize Roland Nolan and Mazarin. And this is George Balas and Peter Hitchens. Okay, so this this shows the tracks of those 5 turtles. And we let the tracks go until the turtles stop transmitting. And at that time, people were having a really hard time tracking hawksbills because they were tending to go under ledges and knock their transmitters off. So we had the highest, the longest tracks recorded to that point in time. Since then, people have gotten a lot better at it. But so this turtle was 311 days. This one was 410 days. This one was 52 days. This very short track, but was a very long duration, 630 days. And this one was 65 days. And you can see that the turtles moved out like spokes on a wheel out onto the Seychelles bank and stayed in shallow waters. And I'm happy to say that all these turtles survived and returned to Kuzan to nest in subsequent seasons. Now, the duration of the individual migrations is shown here. You can see these are the occupancy days, and with the light, more yellow colors being the shorter, the earlier days, and the red ones being the later days. Now, these yellow tracks show the actual migration. So this turtle took 35 days to get to where it's settled in. And this one 51 days, this one 13 days. We can't really say much about this one because it didn't seem to go anywhere. This one was 25 days. Now, so the mean number of days per migration was about 31 days. Okay, so this was important information because it told us that adult females tend to stay within the EEZ of Seychelles. It told us that the most vulnerable time of their life was at the nesting beach in Seychelles, and that they were relatively safe at their feeding habitat because they were away from people. And it told people in Seychelles that they can't blame other countries for the decline in nesting hawksbill populations in the inner islands. Because this was in the early days of really serious turtle conservation. This was like 1998. Remember, the law was passed in 1994 to protect turtles. And people were saying, oh, why should we sacrifice when people in other countries are killing our turtles? Well, at least when it comes to hawksbills, they weren't. So that meant that Seychelles needed to realize that these were their turtles. Okay, now remember the second biggest nesting population in Seychelles is found in the Amirantes group. And so in 2014, the question was, where do nesting females go after nesting in the Amirantes? Now you see here, you have the Seychelles bank with all these turtle islands on the bank, and the turtles did not go beyond that bank. So the question was, do the turtles in the Amirantes stay on the Amirantes bank? Do they go to the Seychelles bank, or do they go somewhere else? And so we set out to solve that question by going to Daros. And Daros and Kuzan actually have similar numbers of nesting hawksbills. And Daros is certainly the most important nesting population in the Amirantes bank. And Save Our Seas at the Daros Research Center funded this work. And we satellite tracked 7 post-nesting female hawksbills from Daros Island using Spot 5 wildlife computer tags. And the deployment was done by Dr. Rainer von Brandes and myself. And so it turns out that the turtles went to the Seychelles bank, which is quite interesting. They didn't stay on the Amirantes bank at all. At least the ones we tracked didn't. This is data which is kind of comparable to what I was showing you before. This is the duration of the migrations for these 5 turtles. So, this yellow spotted track for this turtle lasted 26 days, for this one 18 days, for this one 19 days, this one 10 days, and this one 54 days. The mean number of days was 25. And one thing that's quite interesting is take a look at this turtle. This track, this 376. Notice her right rear quadrat is pretty much missing. Most of it is missing. And when we went to track her, we were discussing, should we track her or not? Maybe she, won't be a good specimen. But she was a great specimen. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she swam all the way out to the far end of the Seychelles bank. Okay, now this is the 6th turtle. This is where it starts to get kind of odd. This turtle started at Daros, went all the way around here, swam all the way around the outer side of the Amirantes, and finally ended up on her foraging area on the Seychelles bank. And then this turtle, the seventh turtle, was a very strange turtle. Her migration was 87 days, but she went back and forth between the Amirantes bank and the Seychelles bank 3 times. And it seems that she may have stopped, this is a 3-month-long migration, really. So she may have stopped to feed en route at Day4 here, and also returned back to the Amirantes bank, probably had some lunch for a few days, and then headed back again, and finally found her foraging site. So it's interesting to see the Kuzan turtles went straight to their foraging sites, but the Amirantes turtles had a little bit more difficulty, perhaps because they had to cross that deep ocean. So these are just a few interesting migration statistics. Kuzan Island, the average, these are our averages for the turtles track. The number of days that the Kuzan turtles took to migrate was 31 days. The number of days the Daros turtles took to migrate was 42. And if you think about it, that's not that much longer, is it? The total distance migrated on average by the Kuzan turtles was 163. The total distance migrated on average by the Daros turtles was 882 kilometers. The straight line distances were 106 on average for the Kuzan turtles and 267 on average for the Daros turtles. And this is what I find really interesting. The speed of travel differed greatly between the two sets of turtles. The average number of kilometers traveled per day for the Kuzan turtles was 5.4. And the average number of kilometers traveled per day for the Daros turtles was 23.5. So you can see here that this, migration for the Daros turtles was a lot more, had a lot more cost than for the Kuzan turtles. And this may be showing up in the intervals between nesting seasons that we're showing from our flipper tagging studies. Kuzan and inner island turtles in general take an average of about 2.6 years between nesting seasons for individual females. But in Daros, it seems to be longer, and we need to get more data on that to see if how much longer it is. This is looking at the data in a slightly different way. This is a graphical presentation showing the speed in terms of kilometers traveled per day and the straight line distance traveled per day. And so here you can see these are the Kuzan turtles. They generally stayed pretty slow, under 10 kilometers a day. Whereas the Daros turtles were really zipping along. And I think this is quite interesting. The comparison here, these 3 turtles all traveled more or less the same straight line distance between their nesting beach and their foraging ground. But look at that, even though it was the same distance, the Daros turtle was going much faster than the Kuzan turtle. And it's hard to say exactly what was going on here, but it could be that the Kuzan turtles were traveling over shallow water, relatively shallow water the whole time. So they probably maybe didn't feel under a great deal of pressure to get to where they needed to go. Whereas the Daros turtles had to traverse open sea and very deep waters, and some of them were lost. So maybe that speeded them up so that they could get to a place where they could find forage again. Oops, how come it's not moving? Okay, this is a Google Earth map, as you can see, showing the region, the Southwest Indian Ocean region. And as we've already talked about, you've got your three main Hawksbill turtle nesting populations in the Seychelles: Inner Islands, Amirantes, and Platte Island. This is Platte down in here. And it's safe to say that in most cases, the turtles are probably using the Seychelles bank. But I'm very curious to know, oh, and one other thing, we do get outliers. We do get turtles that do weird things. Like there was one turtle that was tagged in the Inner Islands that ended up in Kenya. We got a tag return from Kenya. That's our only international tag return for the adult females. But I think one thing to consider is that adult hawksbills, we know from our satellite tracking projects in other places, the adults tend to be fairly conservative. They move between a nesting and a feeding ground that generally isn't too far away. But we've been tracking juvenile hawksbills at several sites. At Daros, and also I've been working on projects in the Chagos in recent years. And those juveniles can really travel long distances. So there's a lot more to learn about that. But what I'm interested in terms of adult hawksbills is, where do these turtles from these three Seychelles populations go? Farquhar turtles, we have been monitoring them quite well over the last 10 years. And the population is stable or decreasing. And I'm concerned that these turtles may be traveling to places like northern Madagascar and possibly running into problems. We should do a satellite tracking study of them. Another thing that's really quite interesting is to look at the satellite tracked adult green turtles from various sites. We've satellite tracked turtles at St. Joseph at Daros. And a couple of them, out of 4 turtles, 2 went to Desroches. One went to Platte. There's a reef on Platte, and one headed off and went as far as Aldabra and stopped transmitting. Also, we've been tracking a lot of turtles from Chagos. These are post-nesting green turtles. And these ones love the Amirantes. They love Farquhar. They love Providence Bank. They love the east coast of Africa, but they do not go to the Seychelles Bank. So this is showing, partitioning in terms of the feeding areas for the adult green turtles and the adult hawksbills. And just to point out that although the adults do have a tendency to follow certain patterns, I just wanted to show this really interesting track that was produced by Marine Conservation Society of Seychelles back in 2009. Back at that time, MCSS tracked about a half a dozen turtles, and most of them were behaving like our Kuzan turtles. They started from Mahe, and they stayed on the Seychelles Bank. But this one particular turtle had a duration of migration that was about 213 days, and she went all over the place and finally ended up in Madagascar. So they're very interesting animals. I wanted to acknowledge the fact that the maps and the quantification of the movement data were produced by Dr. Ryan Daly from Save Our Seas and Dr. Lara Sousa, who's now at Oxford. And of course, I want to thank our funders, especially Save Our Seas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeanne. Yeah, I was so busy listening to you. I almost forgot that I was the chair and I was supposed to be checking the time. Okay, so we'll take some questions now if we have them. Let me just check. Okay, so we have one up now, Jeanne. I thought that the turtles were able to navigate by magnetoreception, but does the difficulty the Amirantes turtles had navigating in deep water suggest that they prefer using visual reference with the seafloor?
Okay, we don't know exactly what they're using, but we do know that they probably are using magnetic at some level, and they're using other cues at other levels, which could involve smell. It could involve other things we don't completely understand. But there's been a recent study done by one of my collaborators who I'm working with in Chagos. And he was analyzing tracks of our Chagos turtles, some of which went all the way from Chagos to Somalia, which is huge. I mean, that's 5,000 kilometers. And what was really interesting is, in terms of going in the general direction, which was probably using magnetic field, they would just go straight, and they seemed to know exactly what direction they wanted to go. But once they started getting into island finding, where they're trying to fine tune the place where they're going to, like getting to a specific point, then that's where they get messed up. And that's where you start seeing them going around in these big circles and before they can find their way. And what was interesting are our green turtles that we tracked from St. Joseph Atoll. The one that went to Aldabra just went straight. It didn't mess around at all. The one that went to Platte went pretty straight too. The two that were going 40 kilometers to Day Roche, traveled 400 kilometers to get there. And both of them just went around and around and around until they finally honed in on Day Roche. So it looks like they're using, several layers of cues to get them where they want to go.
Okay, we have another one. So what priorities are there now for turtle research in the Seychelles?
Well, there's always things to do. We don't know much about male turtles. And as far as satellite tracking, it would be interesting to track some males. But another thing too, I think it's a question. One set of turtles that we don't know enough about is the green turtles in the inner islands, like in the inner islands and in the Amirantes. Especially in the inner islands, since I would love to see someone do some satellite tracking of post-nesting female green turtles in the inner islands. A very good place to do that from would be North Island, who has substantial numbers of, relatively substantial numbers of green turtles, and they have the capacity to do such a study. I'd love to see them do that, because here you have these green turtles nesting on the Seychelles bank, which is generally a popular feeding area for hawksbills, but not for green turtles. So where do the green turtles, who would nest in Seychelles, on the Seychelles bank, where do they go to feed? So that would be one question.
Okay. We'll take the final two. I think we are okay with time for you to take another two. So is the green hawksbill divide seen elsewhere? And is anything preventing the greens from nesting in the inner islands? If this happened, would you expect to see a decrease in hawksbills?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think what's preventing green turtles from nesting in the inner islands is mostly that they get their heads cut off, and then you don't get much nesting done once that happens. So I think historically there may have always been most of the green turtle nesting in the southern islands, but there were certainly more green turtles nesting in the inner islands than there are now. I mean, now we're talking about tens of well, except for North Island and Bird Island, which both have, a reasonable number of green turtles nesting now. You really only have like one, two. But I think that there's plenty of room for more green turtles to nest, but they need to be protected. An interesting situation is the Amirantes, where you have almost equal numbers of green turtles and hawksbills, and they seem to do well together. There's you're talking about hundreds of female hawksbills and hundreds of female green turtles. There is a bit of kind of partitioning temporally. Green turtles tend to peak during the months of March, April. It depends. If you look at Daros, for example, they peak in February, March. But if you look at St. Joseph, located just a couple kilometers away from Daros, they peak very clearly in July, August, September. So green turtles' seasonality is very strange. Green turtles do tend to nest all year round in Seychelles, but they do have peaks. So if you look at the inner islands, and even in the Amirantes, where you have your hawksbills, your low period for green turtle nesting coincides with your high period for hawksbill nesting. So this would help to keep the competition down. So I think we shouldn't be afraid of having too many green turtles. I think we should let them come back, and I think they'll get along well together.
And the final one, what can be the impact of climate change on turtles' migration?
Yeah, well, turtles, I mean, climate change can impact turtles in lots of ways. Claire's already talked about some of the problems on the nesting beach, but specifically about migration, it's you have current systems in the open ocean, and these current systems do depend on on temperature variables. And this is one thing that a lot of environmentalists are really frightened about, is if the temperature warms too much, what's going to happen to the current patterns? You know, there's been talk about, like in the Atlantic, will the Gulf of Mexico, in the Gulf of Mexico, you have the Gulf Current. If it gets too warm, will it just stop? You know, because this is all driven by differences in temperature. So how it's going to affect them, we don't know, but I think we need to be concerned that it you know, changes in temperature can affect them.
Okay, all right, thank you. Some not so good news to end this this wonderful presentation, but thank you, Jeanne.